Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today's story takes us to the Pacific in 1942, where the tide of history began to change. The Pacific stretched wide, restless with history. In the spring of 1942, the horizon looked calm, yet beneath the waves a storm was forming. From the west came silhouettes of giant American carriers, cutting through the ocean like fortresses of steel and will. The sea shimmered with salt and destiny, as though the ocean itself understood that something monumental was coming. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet moved with precision. On deck, mechanics readied engines, sailors rolled bombs into place, and pilots gripped helmets, eyes sharp with determination. Each aircraft, painted with stars and stripes, waited like a hawk poised to strike. To the crew, the sight was more than reassurance, it was pride, proof that America was awake. These ships were not just vessels of war. They were floating testaments to resilience, faith, and industrial might. Across the Pacific, Japanese scouts reported movement. Commanders in Tokyo leaned over maps, unease rising like smoke in a quiet room. For years they had believed the Pacific was theirs, a domain carved through conquest and confidence. But now, American carriers appeared like thunderclouds on the horizon, a direct challenge to empire. Whispers spread in war rooms: could Japan withstand such relentless power? Could their strategy survive an opponent that refused to yield? On board the American carriers, life moved with disciplined rhythm. Sailors cleaned decks, wrote letters home, and traded jokes to keep fear at bay. In cramped quarters, they spoke softly of mothers praying in distant kitchens, of fathers laboring in factories, of wives waiting by windows, and children dreaming of safety. These were not abstract hopes, they were the pulse of the fleet. Every roar of the engines carried a message that echoed across the waves. America fought not for conquest, but for survival, ideals, and the right to remain free. The Pacific winds grew stronger as aircraft engines ignited. Propellers spun like clockwork, and the air vibrated with a deep metallic hum. When the first plane launched into the sky, the sound tore through the heavens. One sailor, unable to contain his emotion, shouted, "That's America rising." His voice was swallowed by the roar of engines, but the message rippled across the deck. The carriers trembled, not from the recoil of machinery, but from the beating heart of a nation reborn. The scene was not just about planes or bombs. It was about purpose. Every man on those decks carried something greater than himself, the spirit of a people who refused to surrender. The American flag flapped violently in the wind, its stripes glowing under the Pacific sun, a banner of defiance against tyranny. The men aboard knew that history was watching. Their names might never be remembered, but their courage would echo across generations. In that moment, America's destiny shifted. The Pacific, once dominated by empire, now belonged to those who fought for freedom. The thunder of engines became a promise to the world, to their families, and to the idea that liberty must always rise, even from the darkest waters. In 1942, America had come not merely to fight, but to endure, to prove that strength comes not only from weapons, but from unity, conviction, and an unyielding belief in what is right. The carriers surged forward through wind and salt, symbols of a nation awakening to its role in history. As the planes disappeared into the sky, a sailor whispered, "We'll make it home." No one answered, but every man felt the same hope burning quietly within. They were ordinary Americans, yet in that moment, they carried the weight of the free world. The horizon no longer looked calm. It shimmered with purpose, courage, and resolve. The tide of history had turned, and with it, the world would never be the same. The American carriers pressed forward, their vast shadows stretching across the Pacific like moving continents. For years, Japan had ruled these waters, its empire, sweeping from island to island beneath the crimson flag of the rising sun. But now, each advancing carrier tightened the knot of fear in Tokyo. The rising sun faced a storm, one not of wind or rain, but of will. Its glow dimmed against the cold, unyielding steel of American resolve. On board, the atmosphere pulsed with purpose. Pilots checked their instruments, mechanics labored without pause, and officers studied the sky as if they could read the future in the clouds. The roar of engines, the clatter of tools, and the rhythmic crash of waves formed a symphony of determination. This thunder of activity was more than preparation, it was the heartbeat of a nation carried across the waves. Japanese scouts, circling from afar, reported fleets like mountains. Even they sensed the truth: America was awake, and it would not sleep again. Letters home revealed what truly fueled the fleet: a daughter's laughter, a wife's waiting, a mother's prayers whispered in the quiet of a kitchen. These were not mere sentiments, they were the anchors of courage. Every takeoff was a promise, every bomb a vow that freedom would not fall silent. Across the United States, factories thundered day and night. Sparks from welders lit the sky over Detroit and Seattle, as if mirroring the battle's fire. Industry had become the arsenal of liberty. Each aircraft that roared from a carrier deck was not just a weapon, but the voice of millions declaring, tyranny will not prevail. For Japan, fear spread faster than reports could travel. Commanders realized with mounting dread that America could outbuild, outfight, and outlast them. Their once feared Zero fighters now faced opponents who had adapted pilots hardened by both training and purpose. The tide was no longer theirs. Then came the storm. The Pacific, merciless and endless, unleashed its fury. Rain slashed across decks, waves rose like walls, and winds screamed as though the ocean itself were warning the world to turn back. Yet the fleet did not yield. Steel met storm will met nature. To the men aboard, this was no ordinary tempest, it was a test. The sea demanded to know whether they truly deserved victory. Sailors gripped ropes, shouted over thunder, and moved through torrents to secure the planes. Pilots huddled in ready rooms, helmets beside them, listening to the rain hammering steel. Some prayed, others wrote quick notes home. I will return, stay strong, this fight is for us all. They knew that survival in storm meant survival in battle. When the clouds finally broke, the decks glistened under a pale, silvery sun. Engines coughed, then roared back to life. The fleet pushed onward, battered but unbroken. Nature had tested them and failed. The storm became a symbol. If they could endure the Pacific's wrath, they could withstand anything Japan might unleash. In Tokyo, intelligence officers read the latest reports with disbelief. The carriers had survived the storm and were advancing faster than before. How? One commander whispered, do you defeat a nation? Even the ocean cannot stop? It was more than frustration, it was the sound of inevitability. Resilience was no accident. Back home, welders and machinists had built ships that could bend but not break. Engineers strengthened hulls, and shipyards poured their soul into every rivet. Each vessel embodied the strength of an industrial army that never saw combat, but fought just as fiercely in factories and docks. Morale soared. If we can outlast the ocean, we can outlast anything, shouted one sailor, his voice cutting through the wind. The crew cheered, united not by orders but by faith. They were no longer passengers on a mission, they were guardians of liberty, moving as one body across the sea. Soon, the next battle erupted. Planes lifted into skies still scarred by clouds. Squadrons charged forward, meeting Japanese bombers head-on. Tracers ripped through the gray air, explosions flashed like lightning. Smoke mingled with the remnants of storm clouds, and the sky itself seemed to tremble. But through chaos came triumph, the fleet had been tempered by storm. And now steel and courage fused into one. Each explosion above the waves echoed a single truth. America's carriers were not just machines of war, they were the embodiment of endurance. They could bend but not break, stagger but never fall. Against the fury of both nature and battle, they remained unyielding. As the sun set over the Pacific, its reflection shimmered on steel decks streaked with salt and sweat. The ocean no longer felt endless. With every mile gained, with every battle endured, the carriers carved a path of purpose through storm and flame. And in that vast expanse, the world witnessed a truth that would echo for generations. Nothing can stop a free people who refuse to surrender. The American carriers pressed forward, their shadows stretching across the Pacific like steel continents. For years, Japan had ruled these waters, its empire, unchallenged beneath the blazing red of the rising sun. But now, each advancing carrier tightened the knot of fear in Tokyo. The rising sun faced a storm, unlike any before, its light dimming against the steel of American resolve. On board, the air vibrated with determination. Pilots prepared for launch. Mechanics worked tirelessly, soaked in sweat and salt. The clang of tools, the roar of engines, the hum of propellers all merged into one heartbeat. It was not just the sound of machinery. It was the pulse of a nation carried across the waves. From the decks of the USS Enterprise and Hornet, men gazed toward the horizon, knowing they were the edge of America's awakening. Japanese scouts, circling high above the clouds, sent frantic messages back to command fleets as vast as mountains were moving eastward. For years, Japan had dictated the terms of battle. Now, for the first time, it struggled to react. In Tokyo, admirals leaned over maps and radios, listening to static that carried the sound of a new reality: the empire's dominance was slipping. Letters home revealed what truly powered the fleet: the unseen hands of love and faith, a daughter's laughter, a wife's waiting heart, A mother's whispered prayer, these were the anchors of courage that held the ships steady in the storm. Every launch became a promise, every bomb, a vow that freedom would not fall silent. Across the United States, factories thundered day and night. Sparks flew in shipyards and hangars, where men and women worked side by side. They built planes, tanks, and engines with the rhythm of belief. Industry itself had become the arsenal of liberty. Every bolt tightened, every wing assembled was an act of defiance against tyranny. Each plane that left the carrier's deck carried more than bombs, it carried the will of millions, declaring to the world that democracy would not bow. For Japan, fear spread faster than official reports. It was no longer a question of ships or strategy, but realization America could outbuild, outfight, and outlast them. The legendary Zero fighters, once symbols of superiority, now faced opponents who had learned, adapted, and refused to yield. The tide was shifting inevitably, irreversibly. Above the sea, the clash raged. Dogfights carved streaks of fire through the Pacific sky. Engines screamed, shells exploded, and smoke curled like storm clouds. Amid the chaos, a young pilot's voice broke through the radio static, "We fight. Not for glory, but for tomorrow." His words echoed through the squadrons, uniting them in purpose. The Pacific skies no longer belonged to the rising sun, they belonged to star-marked wings of freedom. As dusk descended, the horizon burned orange and gold. On the deck of a carrier, a sailor whispered, "We will not stop. We fight for freedom, and freedom will endure." His voice was carried by the wind, joining the endless rhythm of the waves. Around him, the crew stood in silence, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They knew they were part of something greater than victory. They were witnesses to a nation's rebirth. The tide of war was turning, not by chance, but by courage, by sacrifice, unity, and faith in something larger than any empire. America had come, steadfast and unyielding, not to conquer, but to restore balance to a world that had lost it. The empire trembled. Across oceans and continents, people who once doubted now believed again in liberty. The sound of American engines became more than the hum of war, it became the voice of freedom rising from the deep. And as the night settled over the Pacific, the stars above seemed to shine brighter, reflecting off the waves like countless banners of hope. The world would remember this moment, the hour when the tide turned, and a free people proved that freedom, though tested, would never be defeated. Hello everyone, this has been Foreign Eyes on America. Across the world, people watched as America's courage met history's storm and changed it. Thank you for watching, and remember, freedom's tide always rises again.